The Meno serves as a kind of bridge between the concerns of Socrates and Plato. As mentioned previously, Socrates was known for his exclusive interest in ethical questions. In particular, he was interested in the care of the soul. The care of the soul meant, for the Greeks, promoting the health of the soul, which in turn meant promoting virtue. In the Apology, Socrates casts himself as a promoter of virtue through the examination of life. He didn't describe himself as a teacher of virtue, not exactly, but rather as a kind of catalyst who would initiate a process of self-examination in his listeners, which would in turn lead them to improve themselves. Nevertheless, to many of his contemporaries, clearly it did appear that Socrates was giving himself out as a teacher of virtue. This apparently is the reputation he had in some circles, which also gave him a reputation for being a sophist, which he had to defend himself against in the Apology. The sophists, as we will recall, were known as men who taught not only rhetoric, but also virtue. It seems reasonable that the historical Socrates might actually have questioned some of the sophists about whether virtue can be taught and whether they could teach it. Plato has him question Protagoras on precisely this topic in the dialogue by that name. And the Meno, our present subject, also begins as a discussion of this topic. However, quickly the dialogue evolves before turning back around, but it evolves for a time into a distinctly Platonic investigation into a very distinctly Platonic concern, one that is questionable whether Socrates would have invented. And this is the question whether there is a form held in common by all instances of virtue. This distinctly Platonic idea that in the case of many different instances of virtue, signaled here by all these little V's, that there's some one thing that they all look to and hold in common, which is the form of virtue. This is one of the first hints of the theory of the forms that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time on in the coming weeks. This philosophical focus on the notion of a common form develops naturally out of what might have been the historical Socrates' obsession with defining terms, giving an intellectual account, a conceptual account, a discursive account, rather than producing examples of something or just relying on a kind of intuitive knowledge. After all, a definition may be conceived as a description of features that all and only things that fall under the definition can have in common. However, Plato takes the notion of a common form in a metaphysical direction that stands in stark opposition to Socrates' claim in the Apology that he never proposed any philosophical doctrines. Now, Meno, who is a young, wealthy young, prominent man who is in Athens as a guest and is searching out apparently sophists. Apparently he's a disciple of some kind, or at least an admirer of the sophist Gorgias. This Meno approaches Socrates with the pedagogical question, how is virtue acquired? And he proposes 4 possible options. So it's worth having a reference of this. So 4 possibilities for how virtue is acquired. First, there's teaching. And of course, the flip side of teaching is going to be learning, but the point here is that there's some teacher who's imparting this knowledge as a teacher does in a classroom, and the person learns it that way. Second is practice. presumably in the way in which one might acquire facility with a musical instrument or learn how to hit a baseball or what have you. Third is nature. Namely, it's innate, you're just born with it. And fourth, none of the above. So these are the four options that Meno initially poses to Socrates. How is virtue acquired? Trying to cut down on some of that reflection there. Teaching, practice, nature, or none of the above. Four possible options. So, ask yourself, which of these do you favor? Do you think it's by teaching that we acquire virtue, by practice, by nature, or by none of the above? We'll come back to that question at the end. Socrates deflects the question, perhaps not surprisingly, with the protestation that he lacks knowledge. He lacks the knowledge to answer this question. And then he doubles down and goes so far as to say that he doesn't even know what virtue is. This places the onus on Meno to instruct Socrates as to the nature of virtue. So Meno replies, and this is 145 in the bottom right-hand column. I will tell you, Socrates, it is not difficult. First, then, if you want to know a man's virtue, I just put the emphasis different there. First, then, if you want to know a man's virtue, that is easy. This is a man's virtue, to take part in the city's affairs capably, and by doing so to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, while taking care that he himself does not suffer anything like that. If you want a woman's virtue, that is not difficult to describe. She must manage the household well, look after its contents, and be obedient to the man. Obviously, we don't have a very progressive attitude here in ancient Athens, but you're probably already aware of that. There is a different virtue for a child, one for a male and one for a female, and for an older man, one for a free man, if you want to know that, and one for a slave, if you want to know that. There are very many other virtues, too, so that there is no puzzle about telling you what virtue is. You see, for each of the affairs and stages of life, and in relation to each particular function, there is a virtue for each of us. And it is the same way, I think, Socrates, for vice. Socrates, of course, is having none of this. He wants the common principle that all of these multifarious virtues have in common. As he says, that in which they do not differ, but are all the same. That's on the left-hand column of 146, just down below where I was reading. The common principle, that's what we want. That in which they do not differ, but are all the same. So what's all the same about these various virtues of various types of people you mentioned, Meno? That's what we want to know when we want to know what virtue is. Socrates makes a crucial assumption here in equating this something with what he calls one identical form, because of which they are all virtues. One identical form. Let's read this in the bottom of 146, left-hand column. Socrates says, even if they are many and multifarious, surely they all have one identical form, because of which they are all virtues. So that's what we want, the form. What's the form because of which all of these things that are virtues are virtues? What Socrates asks Meno for is the form of virtue, we might say, qua virtue, or virtue as regards being virtue. That's what the form is supposed to give us. In support of his belief in a common form, Socrates notes that there appear to be some virtues, such as the so-called cardinal virtues, as they were known, the virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Some of these virtues, and he mentions justice and temperance, that are the same whether they're possessed by a man or a woman or a child. That supports the idea that there's some commonness in all of these different cases. In his first attempt to say what this common form is, Meno gives the obviously inadequate answer that virtue is the ability to rule people. Clearly, he's thinking here, he's confusing the idea of the common form that all of these different instances of virtue share with his idea of sort of what the best form is. What would it be best to have among this multifarious array of virtues that he's laid out? He thinks, well, to be able to rule over people, that would be the best virtue. But Socrates points out that this is not what he's asking for. He points out that this isn't even a necessary condition of virtue. And he turns the discussion back to the search for the common factor. It's not a necessary condition of virtue because, of course, even Meno mentions children and slaves, for example. And yes, in this cultural context, women. And certainly Meno's not going to say that it would be virtuous for any of those classes of people to rule over the city. So it's not even a necessary condition. So Socrates has to explain to Meno what kind of answer he is searching for. And to do this, he makes a digression. He turns his attention to the analogous cases of shape and color. Shape in particular seems to face analogous, if not greater difficulties in stating the form that's common to all shapes. Actually, come to think of it, color is probably equally difficult. What's the form that's common to all colors? What's the form that's common to all shapes? If you just had to answer off the top of your head. And again, in the service of instructing Meno on what it is to define a thing in terms of its form, Socrates offers two different definitions of shape. The first definition that Socrates describes as being suitable for eristical and contentious fellows, that is, people who just want to pick a fight with you verbally, is the definition that shape is that which always goes along with color. That's the eristical definition of shape. Shape is that which always goes along with color. Now, two things stand out about this first definition of shape, which is the kind of thing that you would propose just to engage in the game of verbal back and forth, Socrates says. Two things stand out about it. First, it's hard to refute in the sense that it's hard to find a counterexample. And yet, second, it isn't very intellectually satisfying and it isn't very illuminating as an account of what shape is. It doesn't really clarify the notion of shape. What's Plato's point in proposing this kind of definition first? His point here seems to be to show that the search for a philosophical definition is not intended as some kind of eristical or contentious game, as if trying to provoke an argument over it. Try to refute my definition, as if this were a game. Philosophy is not a game. People can confuse it as such. We saw how in the Apology, Socrates complains about these young, spoiled brat, rich youth of Athens making it into a game and getting him into trouble as a result. But the goal isn't just to try to provoke a definition that no one can refute, even though it sometimes superficially might seem that way in Socrates' dialogues. Rather, the goal is to arrive in friendship with one's dialogue partner at a shared understanding of something. And this is why Socrates, or we should say Plato, has Socrates offer a second definition, one with a more illuminating character. Shape is what a solid meets its limit in. Shape is what a solid meets its limit in. That's more illuminating. That actually clarifies something about what shape is, more so than the first definition. So, after indulging Meno by giving him a definition of color to go along with the definition of shape, one that draws upon Empedocles' theory of the effluences, and therefore a second model of how to give a philosophical account of what a class of things called by the same name have in common, such that they share the common form, Socrates then presses Meno again to now define virtue for me in a similar way, in the way I did. And Meno is starting to catch on. The result is a proposal from Meno that virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to get them. Virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to get them. And we can see we're definitely in a pre-Christian world here in terms of this idea of virtue. That's Meno's idea of virtue. To be an excellent person, it's worth mentioning that the Greek word here for virtue, arete, could also be easily translated as excellent. So Meno is essentially thinking about what it would be excellent to be the kind of person who could desire beautiful things and have the power to get them. That would be excellent. Now, Socrates translates beautiful into good, which he can do because beautiful is understood as being a species of goodness. And he asks the question whether anyone ever desires bad things. This notion of desiring bad things is ambiguous. Does it mean desiring something bad, thinking it is good? Or does it mean desiring something bad, knowing it is bad? So you might desire something bad, but you think it's good. That would be the first option. In your mind, you're desiring something good, but really in the object, it's bad. Or you could desire something bad, knowing it's bad. Those are the two options. And Socrates expresses skepticism that anyone desires bad things in this second sense, that they desire something bad knowing it's bad. So that'd be useful to write these down. So this notion of desiring bad things the two ways to interpret this. One would be desiring something bad, thinking it is good. Second is desiring something bad, knowing it is bad. So this first case, desiring something bad, thinking it is good, I'm sure probably the majority of people who are divorced think back and say, oh, if only I could go back in time and tell my past self that person you want so badly, right, that you think is going to be so good for you, is in fact going to be bad for you. That would be an example of desiring something bad, something that's objectively bad in itself, but you think it's good. That foolish young person who wanted to, marry the bad boy, or marry, the I don't know what the equivalent is, the wild girl or whatever, who seemed to be so fun and it seemed to be so good. Turned out that it in the long run was a very bad thing. Versus desiring something bad, knowing it's bad. So I know this is bad, and I desire it. And so it's the second sense that Socrates thinks is not really a possibility. Desiring something bad, knowing it's bad. He's skeptical, at any rate, that anyone desires bad things, knowing that they're bad things. He constructs an argument to show that no one ever desires something they know is bad. And this argument can be reconstructed as follows. Premise 1. Bad things are harmful to the one who possesses them. Premise 1, bad things are harmful to the one who possesses them. Premise 2, no one desires to harm themselves. Premise 2, no one desires to harm themselves. Premise 3, thus, no one desires things that are harmful to the one who possesses them. Premise 3, thus, no one desires things that are harmful to the one who possesses them. Conclusion, no one desires bad things. So the argument is bad things are harmful to the one who possesses them. No one desires to harm themselves. Thus, no one desires things that are harmful to the one who possesses them. Therefore, conclusion, no one desires bad things. Socrates concludes that people only ever desire things that appear good to them. No one wants bad things. If they desire things that are objectively in themselves bad, it's only because they appear good to them. So this is then going to be a excluded possibility. This is the way we should interpret this notion of desiring bad things. What that really means is desiring things that are objectively bad, but thinking that they're good. This is going to be important and associate a doctrine that's characteristically associated with Socrates, that no one ever does wrong knowingly. No one ever does wrong knowingly. People only ever desire bad things out of ignorance, and so they only ever do bad things out of ignorance. No one ever does wrong knowingly. But this isn't argued here, but you might want to be aware of that connection. Since everyone only ever desires good things in this account, Meno's definition implies that everyone is in the same boat with respect to the desire part of virtue. Remember the definition to desire good things and have the power to get them. Well, everyone only desires good things. And this implies that either everyone is equally good or virtuous, or that virtue really resides in the power to acquire good things, which was the second part of Meno's definition. So you just factor out if you're not prepared to accept that everyone's equally good or virtuous, and you accept Socrates' argument that people only ever really desire good things, at least in their mind, then virtue must really reside in the power to acquire things. The second part of Meno's definition. The first part becomes irrelevant, because everyone's the same in that respect, and everyone's not equally virtuous, clearly. So the definition of virtue now stands as the power to acquire good things, but clearly this definition is inadequate, because it's not virtuous to acquire good things in just any old way. One must acquire them justly. It's not kosher to acquire good things in an unjust way. That doesn't make you virtuous. One must acquire them temperately. It's not, again, a noble or fine action to acquire things to the extent that it just becomes excessive. To acquire more food than you can digest, for example. And one must acquire things also, from this Greek perspective, piously. It doesn't, for example, fit the idea of virtue to become virtuous by robbing temples or something like that. So clearly, virtue isn't just a matter of getting things, no matter how you do it. You have to do it justly, temperately, and piously. And also, virtue isn't a matter of getting things always. Sometimes it's virtuous to abstain from getting things as well. But once one includes a reference to justice and the other parts of virtue, as Socrates says, if you include a reference to justice and the parts of virtue in your definition of virtue, obviously the definition becomes circular. It becomes, as the left-hand column there, 151, becomes a definition: virtue is whatever one does with a part of virtue. Well, that's no definition, right? Includes the thing to be defined within the definition itself. So Meno's first attempt to define virtue as desiring good things and having the power to get them ends in failure. Now, Meno confesses to being very puzzled, and he says benumbed at this point, as if Socrates were a stingray who had stung him and numbed his tongue. Socrates, for his part, accuses Meno of flirting with him. But Meno actually inadvertently raises a important and interesting issue of philosophical methodology at this point. Socrates claims that he does not at all know what virtue is, and yet he wants to join forces with Meno to inquire into it. But Meno quite reasonably asks, this is in the left-hand column of 152, he asks, "How are you going to inquire about it, Socrates, it being virtue, How are you going to inquire into it when you do not at all know what it is? How are you going to inquire into it when you don't know what it is? How are you going to inquire into it when you don't have an idea what you're inquiring into? And Socrates notes that this does, in fact, seem to pose a paradox. The paradox is that it's not possible for a person to inquire, neither about what he knows nor about what he doesn't know. He can't inquire into about what he knows because he already knows it, and so there's no need to inquire anymore. He can't inquire into about what he doesn't know because he doesn't know what he's inquiring about. So how can he inquire? So this is what we might describe as the paradox of inquiry. Which says it is not possible for a person to inquire neither about what he knows nor what he doesn't know. Because in the case of what he knows, there's no need. In the case of what he doesn't know, he doesn't know what he's inquiring about. So that's the paradox of inquiry. It's not possible for a person to inquire, neither about what he knows, nor about what he doesn't know. Not about what he knows, because he already knows it, there's no need for inquiry anymore. And not about what he doesn't know, because he doesn't know what he's inquiring about. So that's the paradox that Meno, rather surprisingly, confronts Socrates with. So isn't this a big problem, Socrates? Meno is basically saying. And Socrates says, no, I'm not buying this. This apparent paradox is, in fact, an illusion. And at this point, the discussion digresses for a bit. It shifts away from the ethical topic of the nature of virtue to the epistemological topic of how it's possible to have inquiry at all, to the theory of knowledge. So, citing certain unknown priests and priestesses and the poet Pindar, Socrates says that they say the soul is immortal. The soul is immortal. So we have a theory of knowledge here that is bound up with or tied up with a particular sort of religious metaphysical picture as well. And not only is the soul immortal, according to these priests and priestesses and the poet Pindar, but it undergoes rebirth many times. And we might note here, parenthetically, the Pythagorean influence, it seems, on Plato here. Remember, the Pythagoreans had this attachment to the doctrine of reincarnation. In its earlier existence, Socrates proposes, the soul has already acquired all knowledge. So here's what he says. This is page 152 in the right-hand column, right after the quote from Pindar, or what's probably a quotation from Pindar, according to the scholars. Here's what Socrates says. Since the soul is immortal then, and has been born many times, and has seen both the things here and the ones in Hades, in the netherworld, in fact, all things, the soul has been born so many times it's seen it all. There is nothing in it it has not learned. Right? So the picture is the soul has undergone these continual rebirths, spending some time down in Hades, back up to the world of the living and so on. It's undergone all these rebirths. such that it's acquired so much knowledge in the course of this. Doesn't really say how here, but some knowledge in the underworld and so forth, such that it knows it all. The soul there's nothing it hasn't learned. So it is in no way surprising that it can recollect about virtue and other things, since it knew them before. For, since all nature is akin and the soul has learned all things, nothing prevents someone who is recollecting one thing, which men call learning it, from discovering all the rest for himself, provided he is courageous and doesn't get tired of inquiry. For the whole of inquiry or learning, in that case, is recollection. So, of course, we're familiar with people who believe that they can recollect their past lives and so on, who believe they're reincarnated. They were Napoleon in a former life or something like that. What Plato's suggesting here, putting in the mouth of Socrates, is the idea that all inquiry is really just like that, like recollecting a previous life, although it's not recollecting a previous life, but it's recollecting pieces of knowledge that the soul had inherent in it, that it had acquired from its previous existence, which is left here rather vague, exactly how this works. So we should foist some doctrine of samsara on this picture or something like that, because it's pretty vague. But he is clear about the conclusion. The whole of inquiry is recollection. So the solution to the paradox of inquiry here is to say, it's not actually a paradox, because all learning is really recollection from a former life. So this is the solution to the paradox of inquiry. So the idea is that there isn't this problem that you can both sort of know and not know at the same time. That was the problem that the paradox seemed to pose, that it seems like what you need is to both know and not know at the same time in order to avoid the paradox. And Socrates here is suggesting, or Plato is suggesting through Socrates as his mouthpiece, that, actually that is possible. It's possible in the same way in which right now there are all kinds of things that if I made a little effort, I could recollect, I could draw out or draw back from my memory bank that I'm not, as it were, strictly speaking, conscious of or aware of right now. And it might take some effort for me to recollect. Like, who were the neighbors in my childhood home? What were their names? I'm pretty confident. I couldn't tell you in 10 seconds, I don't think, right now. But I'm pretty confident that if I wait and thought about it for a minute, I could. So I'm sure if my mother ever watches this video, she'll be appalled that it would take me longer than 10 seconds. But at any rate, that gives you an idea of how you can both sort of know and not know something at the same time if what you're talking about is something that needs to be learned through recollection. So in that way, he solves the paradox by saying that all learning is just a form of recollection. There is no paradox of inquiry. Of course, you might say, well, the solution presupposes this metaphysics, this sort of religiously tinged metaphysics that supposedly comes from mysterious sacred sources and seems kind of wild and fantastical. All of that is true. And Meno himself naturally demands proof that this is true. So Socrates accosts a slave boy, and we get a little mathematical refresher, maybe a little bit of a refreshing diversion from all this philosophy for a while. Plato shows his chops as a math teacher, having Socrates accost a slave boy and demonstrate how by merely asking mathematical questions about a pair of squares that the boy's never seen before in his life, initially a pair of squares, and then it gets more complicated, but through this he can elicit recollections in the boy about the mathematically correct answer. And the way this is supposed to work is that Socrates is keen to point out that this boy gives answers that are all his own answers. Socrates doesn't tell him the answers, but he makes him puzzle it out for himself. But if he didn't get the answers from Socrates or from anyone else, Socrates says, hey, did you teach this slave boy geometry? And Meno says, nope. So if he wasn't taught by someone else, he wasn't taught by Socrates, the answers, then they must have come from inside himself. There must have been, contrary to appearances, and perhaps surprisingly, some kind of innate geometrical knowledge in the slave boy. Recovering knowledge from inside oneself is recollection. So, at least in the case of this kind of learning, mathematical learning, and one might, of course, say, well, what's the scope of this? Certainly, it seems like we learn some things through experience. Are we really learning things through experience? What are Plato's views about, learning things that are just matters of fact that we learn through the course of everyday experience? How does that fit into this picture that learning is recollection? All these questions are kind of left up in the air, and this isn't the place to try to sort through all of this. But at least in this paradigm case of mathematical learning, it seems like Plato is quite satisfied that he's demonstrated that at least mathematical learning is recollection. Socrates also draws the conclusions from this demonstration that mathematical knowledge comes from a pre-human, disembodied existence of the soul, and that therefore the soul is immortal. So two further bold metaphysical claims are drawn out of this little demonstration with the slave boy, that mathematical knowledge comes from a pre-human, disembodied existence of the soul, and second, that the soul is immortal. This leads to the first discussion question. Is there any merit to Socrates' theory that learning is recollection? What might be an alternative account of the origin of mathematical knowledge? If recollection of mathematical knowledge is real, does this imply that the soul had a prior unembodied existence? Why or why not? So this is the first discussion question. It's a wild one. Is there any merit to Socrates' theory that learning is recollection? What might be an alternative account of the origin of mathematical knowledge? If recollection of mathematical knowledge is real, does this imply that the soul had a prior unembodied existence? Why or why not? So, following this demonstration of the reality of recollection as a mode of learning, Socrates and Meno agree to re-engage the discussion over virtue. Meno, however, doesn't want to search for the form or definition of virtue anymore. He doesn't like that game so much. He wants to return to the question of whether it can be taught. That's his concern, because he wants to learn it. Socrates, again, unsurprisingly, complains that it's going about things the wrong way to inquire into how to acquire a thing before we even know what its definition is. But he relents to Meno. As a compromise, he agrees to proceed hypothetically. Suppose virtue is not acquired by teaching. In that case, to which class of things contained in the soul would virtue have to belong? If we suppose that virtue is not acquired by teaching, then by elimination, at least, we can say it cannot be knowledge. It's got to be something else in the soul besides knowledge, because knowledge is always acquired by teaching. Conversely, if we adopt the contrary hypothesis, that virtue is some kind of knowledge, then it would be acquired by teaching. Thus, Socrates shows that the question whether virtue can be taught could, hypothetically, be answered if we could determine whether or not virtue is a type of knowledge. So this question of can virtue be taught, it seems at least, can be translated into or reduced to the question of, is virtue a type of knowledge? If it is, it can be taught, because knowledge is such that it can be taught. If it isn't, if virtue isn't a type of knowledge, then it can't be taught. So the question now is virtue some kind of knowledge? Okay, so Let's investigate that question, Socrates says. How are we going to do this? Well, we know that virtue is good. That's a given. Virtue is good. Hence, if there is nothing that is good that is not also knowledge, that is, in other words, if the good is at least a subset of knowledge, then that implies that virtue as a good thing is also some type of knowledge. So is the good then to be understood as a species of knowledge? I think this probably seems to us as another peculiar suggestion from Socrates. Certainly there are lots of good things besides knowledge, but let's continue on. Let's go with it. So that's the question. Now, is the good to be understood as a species of knowledge? Next, he asks or suggests that since it's also taken for granted that good things are beneficial to their possessor, we can assume this about virtue as well. In a survey of beneficial things, Socrates discovers the fact that it seems that all beneficial things are guided by correct use, without which they become harmful. So medicine is beneficial, but of course it can also kill you if it's not guided by correct use. Physical training is beneficial, but it can also be harmful, very harmful, if it's not guided by correct use. You can hurt yourself through over-exercise and so forth. Wealth is very beneficial, but if it's not guided by correct use, it can get you into a lot of trouble. It can become harmful. So it seems like beneficial things are good and beneficial only insofar as they are guided by correct use. However, correct use depends on those things that could be beneficial or harmful being guided by wisdom. So on page 158, Socrates says, we're on the center of this right-hand column, in a word then, all of the soul's undertakings and acts of endurance, when guided by wisdom, end in happiness, when by folly, in the opposite. So if virtue is one of the things in the soul and is necessarily beneficial, it must be wisdom, since in fact all the others having to do with the soul, taken by themselves, are neither beneficial nor harmful, but become harmful or beneficial when wisdom or folly is added. According to this argument then, since virtue is beneficial, it must be some sort of wisdom. So the basic idea here, what he here calls an argument, is just that it seems that as it were, the special sauce that makes things that in themselves are indifferent or neutral. They could go either way. They could be harmful or beneficial. But the thing that makes them beneficial is wisdom. And that suggests then that virtue must be some sort of wisdom, either the whole of wisdom or a part of it, as Socrates likes to say. Now, we've arrived then at the conclusion that virtue must be some sort of wisdom because it seems like that's what makes things beneficial. But no human being is wise by nature or innately wise. No one thinks that. Everyone must go through infancy, childhood, and youth in which they are not wise. Although, incidentally, I mean, there's certain sorts of romantic ideas in people like Rousseau and Wordsworth, and in a way that perhaps can be found in the Gospels, the New Testament, that suggest that there's a kind of superior wisdom that children have. But let's leave that to one side. Socrates assumes that the common sense view is that little babies aren't wise. Little children aren't wise. They might say something that sounds wise occasionally, but it's just by luck that happens. Everyone has to go through these stages of infancy, childhood, and youth in which they are not wise. And some, if they ever become wise, it's only through some later process. But does this show that virtue is acquired by teaching? If virtue is wisdom and wisdom isn't something natural that we acquire naturally or innately from birth? Although this seems to be the obvious conclusion to draw, that, if virtue is wisdom and wisdom isn't naturally acquired or innate or inborn, then we must acquire it by teaching. But Socrates is hesitant to conclude this at this point. Well, the conclusion that virtue is wisdom certainly suggests that it's acquired by teaching. Socrates has a major qualm about this. And the qualm is this. Teaching implies a teacher. If virtue is acquired by teaching, then there must be teachers of virtue. Conversely, if there are no teachers, this suggests that it's not acquired by learning. But are there teachers of virtue? Socrates has his doubts. Socrates claims to have searched far and wide for teachers of virtue and not found any. So that's why he's resistant to this conclusion, even though the argument to this point seems to have suggested that virtue can be taught. But if it can be taught, where are the teachers? Socrates says, I've looked everywhere, I haven't found them. At this moment in the dialogue, as if on cue, the historical Socrates' nemesis from the Apology, Anytus, appears. Socrates proposes to use the case of Anytus and his father, Anthemion, as an object lesson for the problem he has with finding teachers of virtue. It certainly seems that this father-son duo should be able to tell us whether there are teachers of virtue. Page 159, in the right-hand column, right in the center of the column, he says, Anytus is the son of a wealthy and wise father, Anthemion, who has become wealthy not by chance or as the result of a gift, like Ismenias of Thebes, who recently acquired the wealth of Polycrates, but by his own wisdom and carefulness. Next, as regards other things too, he seems not to be a haughty, scornful, or offensive citizen, but a moderate and well-behaved man. Finally, he brought up and educated Anytus as well, as the majority of Athenians think. At any rate, they chose him for their highest offices. It is right then to inquire with such people to see whether there are any teachers of virtue or not, and who they are. It turns out that when Socrates proposes sending Meno to the sophists to learn wisdom and virtue, Anytus is horrified, exclaiming, "In the name of Heracles, be quiet, Socrates. They, the sophists, plainly pervert and corrupt those who associate with them." Anytus clearly doesn't think very highly of the sophists. He says those who give them money are mad and they should be run out of the city as soon as they arrive. Socrates is, at least outwardly, incredulous. On page 160, he says, those who repair old shoes and mend cloaks wouldn't escape detection for 30 days if they gave back the cloaks and shoes in worse condition than they got them. On the contrary, if they did that, they would soon starve to death. So how could Protagoras escape detection by the whole of Greece if for more than 40 years he corrupted those who associated with him and sent them off worse than when he came? So, obviously, right, he's analogizing the sophists to a craftsman who produces a product. And if the product, in this case, the young men who are supposed to be made virtuous, if they ended up being corrupted, surely someone would have detected this. What do you mean? How could the sophists corrupt the youth and pervert them? On your account, are we to say that they led the young astray and ruined them knowingly, or in a way that escaped detection, even by themselves? Are we to claim they are as mad as that, those who some say are the wisest people there are? It's clearly the case that Socrates is being ironic here in proposing sending Meno to study under the sophists, since he had just expressed skepticism that there are any teachers of virtue. He just wanted to get a rise out of Anytus, knowing how much Anytus despised the sophists. What he really wants to do is elicit Anytus' own opinion about who the teachers of virtue are. So if, okay, they're not the sophists, Anytus, fine, then who do you say that they are? And Anytus answers, any fine and good Athenian he happens to meet. So, in other words, who can teach Meno virtue? Any fine and good Athenian he happens to meet can do that. However, Socrates, unsurprisingly, is ready with an argument against this. And it can be reconstructed something like this, another simple argument. Premise 1. And I'm going to state this in a general way, not relative to Athens, just so that we can see the potential generality of it and ask whether it could be applied to our time. And I am going to retain the reference just to men, but you could, of course, read this as men and women, human beings generally, to think about whether there's any general application to this argument. So the argument is this. Premise 1. There have been many fine and good men in history. Premise 1. There have been many fine and good men in history. Premise 2. If these men knew how to pass their virtue along to their sons, they would have. Premise 2. If these men knew how to pass their virtue along to their sons, they would have. Premise 3. Yet, we know many instances in which the son of a fine and good man turned out to be a scoundrel. Premise 3. Yet, we know many instances in which the son of a fine and good man turned out to be a scoundrel. Conclusion. Hence, these men did not, in fact, know how to pass along their virtue to their sons. In other words, they were not able to teach virtue. So that's the argument. There have been many fine and good men in history. If these men knew how to pass their virtue along to their sons, they would have done so. Yet in many instances, we see a case where the son of a fine and good man turned out to be a scoundrel. So these men didn't know how to pass their virtue along to their sons. Conclusion, they were not able to teach virtue. Socrates concludes that if these men couldn't teach it, then they really didn't possess knowledge of virtue in the first place. And of course, there's a situation here where it's possible, let's say a man only had one son, the son turned out great. There might be this sort of illusion that the father actually did know how to teach virtue to his son. But what Socrates is suggesting is that, well, there are many cases of this, but then if you give the man a second son, that son might turn out to be a scoundrel. And so you have to assume that the man never really possessed knowledge of virtue in the first place. Rather, if they themselves were virtuous, it's because they had true beliefs about virtue. So we get another point made in the conclusion of this dialogue about knowledge, that knowledge is distinct from true beliefs. A man can have true beliefs about things, about virtue, for example, and use that in order to become a good man, but not have knowledge of virtue. Now that raises questions, of course, right? Why could the man then have just passed along his beliefs about virtue and that been sufficient for his son? So there are questions that arise here about what exactly the extra, secret sauce is in the case of knowledge. What does it add? But again, this is not the place where he discusses these questions. In fact, the whole dialogue ends inconclusively. So this is just the primer for Plato's deep dive into a lot of these questions. We don't get conclusions to, we don't get a fully worked out conception of what exactly one of these forms is that we're looking for. We don't get all the questions answered about the theory of knowledge. We don't get virtue defined. We don't get an account of whether it can really be taught or not. If this is an open-ended dialogue that's just meant to prompt our questioning rather than to provide final answers to any of these questions. And this is characteristic of a number of Plato's dialogues, that they have this open-ended character. So this leads to a second discussion question. How would you answer Meno's original question of whether virtue can be taught? Recall the four options that he proposed for the acquisition of virtue: teaching, practice, nature, or none of the above. Which of these four answers would you favor? Do you think virtue is a form of acquired knowledge or something else? Do you share Socrates' skepticism about the existence of teachers of virtue? Why or why not? So that's the second discussion question. Once again, how would you answer Meno's question of whether virtue can be taught? Recall the original four options he proposed for the acquisition of virtue: teaching, practice, nature, or none of the above, which of these four answers would you favor? Do you think virtue is a form of acquired knowledge or something else? Do you share Socrates' skepticism about the existence of teachers of virtue? Why or why not?